I decided to go check out this Chinese film, Malice, just released. Went and saw it. Decided to take a gamble. Not a necessarily acclaimed film, but I figured I like thrillers. Maybe, even if the screenplay is outrageous, maybe just watching the filmic execution will be gratifying. Now, Malice is a very mainstream film, clearly intended toward regular audiences. Where China is concerned, it is not art house, it is the kind of thing which you would find on a streaming service. Material wise, the execution cinematically is pretty top notch professional, clearly a high budget film, although whether we can then claim that the execution itself was artful is quite debatable. The approach of Malice directorially is no revelation, though demonstrates some effective competence in any case, without any gallant creativity either. However, Malice is a fairly interesting film for what it is. Firstly, from the perspective of an English speaker in Australia, it was refreshing to watch a relatively competent foreign language film which is intended for its own domestic audience first and foremost. Most of the art house or festival circuit films I see from other countries in foreign languages are autorially geared toward being universal or being received and appreciated by English language cinematic enthusiasts or just Western critics more generally, or the critics of their own nations who are concerned with the continuum of world cinema largely. Malice is Chinese entertainment for a Chinese audience and is a compelling window into an entire world of contemporary culture which is indifferent to a capitulation to potential American audiences. It is refreshing. Now, Malice's subject matter, quite compelling, I think. A journalist investigates the apparent double suicide of a hospital nurse and a beloved cancer patient young girl who has amassed a noteworthy following on social media. The journalist Ye Pan, portrayed by actress Xiao Fei Zhang, investigates the possibility that it was a murder-suicide, the nurse attempting to kill her patient. The nurse has survived the fall, though is in critical condition. Spoilers here, leave if those concern you. So, assuming they don't, Yi Pan learns from the deceased patient's mother that she firmly believes the nurse to have been responsible for killing her daughter, for pushing her off of the hospital roof and seemingly being dragged down with her. The nurse in question, Li Yu, portrayed by Chen Yu Si, is being tarnished on social media, having apparently had an affair with a senior member of the hospital, a mistress, and many seem to believe the mother's account, even though no proof of her intent have emerged. Gradually, the story unfolds, and it later becomes seemingly believable that the patient's mother, Yu Qian, portrayed by Mei Ting, had the intent of murdering her own daughter, and Yi Pan is on the trail of it all, and expresses great distaste with her boss's determination to capitalize on the trend, via social media, of this inane and highly grotesque case. We witness in general a fascinating study of the social media phenomenon in a nation that has consumed it very readily. Everyone is determined to ensnare attention and gains from a major cultural moment via the media praxis, in a manner not dissimilar but distinct to the media circuses of the 20th century. It was apt that I recently viewed films like Natural Born Killers, Dog Day Afternoon, and in a way the very recent Superman film, though more on that soon, later. Eventually it is made quite clear, via a security camera situated on a crane that was stationed nearby this hospital, that the nurse was attempting to prevent the young girl from committing suicide and was dragged down inadvertently with her. The nurse, Li Yu, does not recover and dies not very long after her fall. It is Ye Pan who becomes demonized by the public through social media as a journalist who has attempted to exploit and magnify the intense sufferings of other members of the public, succeeding the target on Li Yu, which then transferred to Yu Qian, and finally onto Ye Pan. Fortunately for Ye Pan, the social media hive mind finds other things to occupy its disdain, venom, and urge to destroy something to elevate their own status. Ye Pan had previously been the subject of controversy, blamed for the death of one of her earlier journalistic subjects, and this comes back around to haunt her to sever her place in the media ecosystem in a very tactile way. The script in general serves as a fascinating case study upon the social media stranglehold on human pathos, the amorality of media moguls who intend to exploit what they perceive and celebrate as the ignorance of the public. It is arguably a damning indictment of this facet of culture, and maybe one of the few pieces of media in the contemporary which is quite resolutely negative on the whole in its assessment of social media. From Australia, I am reminded of the fiasco in the media surrounding the mushroom murders, wherein a sickly case which really ought to have been left to the courts and law enforcement was feasted upon by the media, as they employed it as a repellent serialized soap, shamelessly exploiting people's grim fascination with the subject from a public who amorally, like checking out a car accident, wanted so badly to know the outcome. Not on a scripted show, but of a case which involved the deaths of 3 individuals and a defendant in court on an issue which should be resolved in the court without media involvement or smothering of the case. Australia has a long history of this, going back to the Chamberlain case of the 1980s, well known internationally, when Lindy Chamberlain was accused of murdering her infant daughter and claiming that dingoes had killed her. Whilst the injustices regarding that case may have been generally independent or potentially independent of the media's involvement, the media, or at least the corporate media, was expressly determined not to remain neutral on this matter long before any court had reached a verdict. For those who aren't aware, there was a case where Lindy Chamberlain's daughter was killed by a dingo, and ultimately the courts, for reasons that I don't recall off the top of my head at the moment, the Supreme Court specifically, as opposed to the initial court in the Northern Territory, which believed that she was innocent, there was ultimately a case. She was briefly charged and imprisoned, although she was eventually released, and there seems to be quite clear evidence she did not murder her daughter, and the daughter was killed by the dingoes. Anyway, and modern social media magnifies these horrifying cases. Just imagine if the Chamberlain case had occurred today with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, and you have a perfect idea of what social media has done to us, even if it is assuming, or being subsumed rather, by pre-existing media monopoly empires' role. The major influences depicted in Malice appear to be also under the contract or employ of Ye Pan's corporate boss. In respect, it reminds one of a 1981 American film called Absence of Malice, directed by Sidney Pollack, though in the contemporary environment. And actually, recently I commented that Dog Day Afternoon by Sidney Lumet places us in the role of the hostages of Sonny and Sal, Pacino and Cazale, and we receive Stockholm Syndrome via liking them. It doesn't help that we tend to like Pacino and or Cazale as actors, of course. And then in the position of the onlooking public, as our perception of Sonny potentially changes once we learn of his motives in regards to his romantic affection for Leon. In Malice, we are in the position of the social media-obsessed public. We as an audience viewing a narrative unfold before us, we are initially convinced, or we can see no visible alternative than what the patient's mother, Yu Qian, claims, that the nurse Li Yu had murdered her daughter. However, when we witness the unearthed footage of Yu Qian hesitating or withholding the oxygen device from her sick daughter as she struggles for breath, and Li Yu coming to her aid, we assume that we and Ye Pan have been duped, and we almost chastise ourselves for letting the media, in their case the social network / corporate coordinated circus, in our case the film itself, get the better of our inquisitive judgment. And then again we chastise ourselves when, despite that seemingly damning footage of Yu Qian pondering whether it would be merciful to end her beloved daughter's pain permanently, the God's Eye view via the crane's camera demonstrates that ultimately it was the daughter who chose to end her life, and Li Yu who died trying desperately to save her at the cost of her own harm and eventual demise. It is an intriguing parable. I think the film's speculative drama is in the right place. Maybe they too are exploiting genuine concerns for cheap, creatively entertainment, but it is bound to make at least some viewers think, and I wouldn't put it past some sectors of the establishment, political or media or cultural, to abhor what certain corporate bodies attempt to do to influence the wider population. I have to admit, the fervor and anger emerging amongst this Chinese social environment cannot help but, at least for me, recall the furor of the Red Guards of Mao's Cultural Revolution, the simplicity with which young people were manipulated, how they so willingly turned on previous heroes in the cause of a program or algorithm, and how it becomes a force which consumes those who had initially molded it for their initial gain. And the reason I bring this up is because no doubt this is a period in Chinese history which most or all do not want to see repeated. Even Xi Jinping's father, as well as Xi himself, suffered greatly during those years, And perhaps this is part of the reason why the filmmakers, even if they are amongst, or especially if they are amongst, the establishment, would want to warn against this mass frenzy, hive mind mob mentality, because it has brought China great suffering before and ought to be prevented from ever occurring at such or even any scale again. I also recalled one of the most compelling, arresting pieces of footage in Tarkovsky's Mirror of Soviet soldiers holding back some fanatical, angered young Red Guards, aggressively shoving Mao's Red Book into the air, somewhere in the snow, perhaps at a border between China and the USSR. The initial enablers of the socialist governments, at that time the Soviet Union, are bewildered and alienated to the enthusiasm and fever gripping their immediate descendant in the PRC. Wonder, perhaps, what the hell they or their government, rather, has unleashed. In Malice, the media representatives are unable to contain the anger and mass emotion that rises up, a hysteria that they initially mined or helped create for the sake of their greedy profits. The message ought be quite clear to a great most of us. I am also reminded to some extent of an utterly brilliant film from Takahisa Zeza, a Japanese filmmaker, titled My Friend A, which was released in 2018 and that I would highly recommend everyone go and see. It was an incredible fulfillment of the capacity of the feature filmmaking form as it initially emerged back in the mid-1910s. The sound design was horrible, it must be said, and this is what held the film back most inescapably, and will be one of many things cited when snooty film snobs hoping to watch some world cinema refer to this as mainstream trash. Like, it is, in a categorical respect, when defining where it belongs in the wider film industry of China, though it is actually a compelling and even vaguely commendable piece of so-called mainstream trash. Maybe we could liken the creators of mainstream entertainment for the masses as a broken clock which offers an occasional twice-a-cycle relevant insight. I cannot claim that Malice is a great film, but it is a relatively strong one for what it is, and I'm certainly glad I saw it. I had an enjoyable time at the cinema, a late night screening at 9:30 p.m, a pretty modest audience, fun stuff. Don't rush to be so snooty with Malice and identify it as the kind of mainstream fare for audiences who never heard of Jean-Luc Godard, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, or even Zhang Yimou or Ye Lu. Because even though it is, why can't these films be reasonably strong from time to time? Possibly melodramatic, almost definitely sensational, and shamelessly mainstream. And yet, in being so shamelessly mainstream, maybe it could more readily identify the theme of the moment, rather than being so introspective and trying to relate what it is doing with the history of great film directors, as world cinema acclaimed auteurs are sometimes often want to do. Maybe in this act of populist entertainment at a very high budget, though, we are witnessing a more precise vision of the now than those composed by introverts and snobs, even if those films are undeniably more impressive compositionally, intellectually, or more stimulating in any respect. They aren't always necessarily appealing to the now so much as occupying a timeless place, wherein we can view them in posterity as taking place in auteurland. 400 Blows doesn't feel like a 50s film, Antonioni's films, maybe sans Blow Up in a good way, don't feel like films necessarily of the 60s moment, even if they were less imaginable before then. Certainly Zhang Yimou's films, most period pieces of course, don't feel like 80s or 90s films as we understand them. His 2000s films might feel assertively like that decade. However, Herzog's films don't usually scream their decades beyond some production values either, to my immediate memory at least. However, Malice will forever stand as an insightful snapshot into the mid-2010s, and if we choose to abolish social media, voluntarily and without government repression, as we really ought to, I suspect, future generations have Malice to know what it was all like, and, most refreshingly for a piece of mainstream media, why it was ultimately a plausible net negative upon our fragile societies. Thank you for watching, I hope you are all well, and I wish great peace and happiness upon you all. Go forth and find fulfillment, or cherish any fulfillment you may currently feel.